It is my honor to introduce our afternoon session keynote speaker, Dr. Jonathan Moreno. He is the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor, the Penn Integrates Knowledge PIK Professor, and the Professor of Medical Ethics and Health Policy of the History and Sociology of Science and of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Moreno is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He earned his PhD in philosophy from Washington University in St. Louis, that Washington University, and holds an honorary doctorate from Hofstra. He is the recipient of a College of William and Mary Law School Benjamin Rush Medal, the Jean Mayer Award for Global Citizenship from Tufts University, and the Penn Alumni Faculty Award of Merit. He's a renowned author of many books, one of which I read in preparation for this colloquium, called Mind Wars, The Brain, Research, and National Defense. His talk is entitled Mind Wars, Brain Science and the Military in the 21st Century. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Moreno.
Hi, Joe. Thank you so much, and thanks to Dan as well. Want to make sure you can hear me? Are we on? Good. So it's not nearly as much fun to talk to a group this way as it was in the old days when you could actually go and see people and interact with colleagues. But here's where we are. I have to say it's kind of a pleasure not to be talking about the pandemic for a change, going back to my old world. So I want to be clear, I am not a scientist, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not an engineer. I'm a philosopher by training, and I'm a historian Monkey. I am what you might call a parasite on some of the brilliant science that you heard this morning and you will hear this afternoon, or more kindly, I consider myself an ethnographer, somebody who's been following people who work in neuroscience, and particularly people who work at what might turn out to be the intersection of neuroscience and national security. These are a couple of the books. I don't know which one Joe read, but I'm hoping that he bought a lot of them. I'm not asking you to read them, just help me out. These are a couple of the books that have to do with what I'll be talking about today. So first, apologia, our defenses. We've been asked to do some predictions. Was it Yogi Berra who said there's nothing harder to predict than the future? Attributed to lots of people, particularly baseball managers. But I do want to say a couple of things about this. That the future is a new idea. It's probably only been around since the Enlightenment, and maybe a little more than that. Some people attribute it to Christianity as well, maybe to the Jewish tradition, but it's not. The future isn't what it used to be, and it's always tomorrow. Apologies to Annie, and anybody who's a huge science fiction fan like I am appreciates that predictions are a reflection of what we're doing now, and they are also a prediction when we get into the technology game. They're a prediction of not only what our technologies can do sort of within arm's length, but also what we would want them to do now, which we might not want them to do some years from now. And yet we need to try. I grant you, we can't help ourselves. It's the way we're built. We need to try. So I'm just going to note that we are in the era of big neuroscience. You might say that the era of big physics was the atom bomb. Era of big biology was the Genome Project. And now, unquestionably, we can say we're in the era of big neuroscience. Now, these are just two of the governmental projects that we know about, the Human Brain Project in the EU, which the original director of which, Dr. Markham, said, we're going to simulate the human brain. I think that's not exactly what the HBP does. It really is a data aggregation project from lots of different countries, neuroscience efforts. And then, of course, the Obama Brain Initiative, maybe the only thing that the Obama administration agreed with the Republican Party about. It was a good idea. To a very great extent, motivated because of post-traumatic stress disorder with our people coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and the pressure to try to figure out what to do about dementias, for which there's really not much in the pipeline. So the Brain Initiative, American style, really committed to applications. So for years, I've been showing this slide, thanks to Margaret Kosal, my friend at Georgia Tech, who poured through the federal budget to get these numbers, 9 years ago. It's still useful, I think, to see this somewhat concretely. And then the Brain Initiative gave DARPA another $50 million back in 2014, 2015. So this is real money, and this is only cognitive neuroscience. So the softer side of neuroscience, not some of the hard stuff we've been hearing about this morning. I don't know how many people are really using the term third offset anymore, but in the old days when people did talk about the third offset, these were the dimensions that they talked about. What's striking to me is that if you break this down, all of them have to do with neuroscience or neurotechnology or AI. And so I think people appreciate how important these ideas continue to be. So DARPA has already been mentioned. We've heard mention already of the REMIND program, of subnets, of NeuroFast. I took this page off the web, and you go down the page and there are lots of other projects as well. And of course, IARPA is doing some really interesting projects on, for example, on neural systems, insights into the brain's representation of conceptual knowledge, and ONR doing its computational neuroscience program. I don't know where this stands now. Maybe somebody else does, but here's the point. There's such a variety of potential projects that it is, I'm going to say, brain-boggling. And when you have so many possibilities, so many potential areas to work in, so many hypotheses, it's a problem that philosophers call the economy of science. Which do you select to work on? I want to say before I forget that although we've been hearing mostly about electrochemical systems and devices today, I also want to say that there are other areas that we should not forget about that have to do with pharmacology and with, as Bob Ladoff mentioned, influencers, what we used to call propaganda. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of this. Is all related to, in my view, to neuroscience, especially in the cognitive level, the social level. I think there are three critical questions, though, that we don't often think about when we're doing sessions like this, because like all of you, I am totally dazzled by the science. And the science in the laboratory is moving along at a rapid clip. But I want to suggest that the translation is a completely different issue. So I've never been in the military. I've never been a commander. But if I was a commander, I think I would ask myself these kinds of questions. What's the problem I'm trying to solve? What's the low-hanging fruit among the various options? And does it need to be done this way? And part of what I want to ask rhetorically when I say does it need to be done this way is, are there simpler ways to address this problem? Are there ways to address this problem that don't require a lot of support in the field? Because if it's one person who is running the drone, how many people in the background are helping to run the drone? I think if we're thinking about what's plausible and practical, we need to ask these questions along with moving the science along in the laboratory. And since I will not have, as I already suggested, a whole lot of predictions, I am going to have a prediction, but at my last slide, it's going to be a cheat. So if that kind of keeps you on your toes, I hope that I can do that. So this is a pretty comprehensive list of topics I'm going to touch on the next few minutes. I'm not going to be able to say much about anything. I actually borrowed this from the European Union's Human Brain Project, National Security Military Ethics Assessment. And I think it's a pretty good list, best one I've seen. I like to point out to my students in terms of the history and sociology of knowledge that every generation is preoccupied with what's going on in its own time. So here, for example, from the late 1980s, our colleagues at the National Academies, in the days when we called reports National Research Council reports, they did a very interesting study of what the Army was investing in with respect to what was called then the mind race or warfighter enhancement, which had to do with essentially training people in the 1st Earth Battalion to be warrior monks, including the use of ESP, leaving their bodies at will, levitating, psychic healing, and walking through walls. And if you want to know more about the warrior monks, you can see this film that George Clooney produced a few years ago. A little disappointing, wasn't quite as good as I thought it would be, called The Men Who Stare at Goats. This came out of a fascination with kind of New Age ideas in the 1970s and 1980s. My understanding is that the Army isn't doing this anymore, but I don't have any inside information. And then I mentioned earlier psychopharmacology. So when we think about warfighter enhancement, we have to think about modafinil, which I believe has been approved by the Air Force for pilots since 03 or 04. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, modafinil can keep you awake and alert with no measurable loss of cognitive function for 60 to 80 hours. Modafinil is prescribed for professors like me who, in the old days, we actually flew across time zones to go to Asia to give talks and flew back in a couple of days, a practice that my wife thought was totally insane. And I will say that for purely scientific reasons, I have tried this stuff and, it can work. There are other ideas here that have a little more device-oriented. This is, I think it was Bob who mentioned a New Yorker cartoon. This is one from many years ago. And this is a teacher, obviously, talking to a couple of very anxious parents. We found by applying just the tiniest bit of an electric shock, test scores have soared. With so many of our kids out of school right now, might want to try this. Transcranial magnetic stimulation or a transcranial current stimulation. TMS, pretty expensive, TDCS at the bottom. People are doing this with a 9-volt battery and a couple of pads and taping it to their foreheads, and then they're playing Sudoku, and they're blogging about how much better they are at Sudoku after they've done this to themselves. I don't recommend it. It can burn the scalp, but people do think that these things can actually have a functional effect. I know that people in psychiatry thought, I think a dozen years ago or so, that for people with depression that was refractory to ECT, that TMS would replace ECT routinely for people who have depression. I don't know that it's quite done that, but there are certainly people who are interested in that. Something about warfighter enhancement that now takes me into teaming. So just one example of the many projects that have been out there for the last few years, direct neural interfacing between warfighters. It could be much more efficient to have these people linked directly through their brains than it would be to get information over earphones like I've got, or to be doing the old-fashioned pointer. And this idea sort of got a lot of play, 8 or 9 years ago, was it, when at the University of Washington, there were two graduate students, one on one end of the campus, one end of the other, using the internet, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and a light in the other fellow's that illuminated the other fellow's brain. A trigger was pulled at the right moment. So I think we have to be very careful about hyperbole here. To me, this is really not brain-to-brain interface. There's several technologies here. Our interface right now, it seems to me intuitively, is more direct than this was. And certainly if we were together at 505th, it would be still more direct if I was talking to you. So I think we have to be really careful about how we characterize what's going on here. Undoubtedly, many of you are familiar with the work of the Nicolelis lab at Duke. And as you know, 15 years ago, Professor Nicolelis did a fascinating experiment in which he was able to reach a monkey's motor intent through the cerebral cortex. This is a little film that I was given by Anjan Ramachandran, who used to be at Penn. He was a Nicolelis student. And this is a project he did. He's now back in India with a really nice professorship, as he deserves. Really great job he got there. But here's a kind of an interesting concept. And this is so much, in a way, less sophisticated than the kind of thing we were being told by Professor Anikieva earlier. But here the idea is you have chronically implanted monkeys, and each of them is getting a shot of juice. Each of them is in control of either the red dot or the blue dot, and when they cooperate in moving that black dot into the center circle, they get a shot of orange juice, which they seem to like a lot. So this is kind of a next step from what Nicolelis was doing in getting to the motor intent of monkeys. We can argue about how interesting this is for our purposes. Again, as a parasite, I get to show these films without understanding exactly what the import is or how they're done. But I'm told by Dr. Ramachandran that you do not want to spend a lot of time with these monkeys. They're very unpleasant. And this is a very expensive experiment. I did ask him, because I know that DARPA was kind of interested in this a few years ago. What if you could somehow link Henry Kissinger and some generals and some admirals all together and present them with a tactical problem? Could you get them to cooperate and figure it out through their mental power alone? And he smiled at me and said, I'm an engineer. Give me the engineering principles and I can do it. And I think that's very much in the spirit of what we heard a couple of our colleagues, Dr. Howard and Dr. Anikieva, say this morning. Give me the engineering principles. All that being said, I'm going back to my earlier question. Is it worth it? Is it really solving a problem that we have? Along these lines, we already heard Dr. Howard's really interesting talk about his Kiwi chip. Certainly, we've come a long way from this one that the people at BrainGate were using with this subject, this man who has tetraplegia and was able to move a cursor on a keyboard. This is 15 years ago, I think now. I'm losing track as I go on, trying to follow this work. And 3 years ago, Facebook introduced its project in which it was going to basically let you type on a keyboard using your brain alone. And they promised 100 words a minute. Now, I just looked it up, and apparently a pretty good typist can type 38 to 40 words a minute. If you could do 100 words a minute with your brain alone, that's pretty good. But the experiments I've seen so far in the laboratory with a woman with tetraplegia was about 6 words a minute. Now, not yet doesn't mean never, but there's clearly a long way to go here, and a very long way to go if you're thinking in terms of higher cognitive functions like Henry Kissinger and a few generals working on a problem together directly through mental power alone. I'd love to recall the work of Dr. Delgado, brilliant neuroscientist, neuroengineer, who, when I was a kid, I think it was 1962 or 63, did this fascinating experiment with a bull that is Dr. Delgado in the ring in Spain. And he had an implanted bull, and he touched what he called his stimoceiver, and as the bull was charging at him, he pushed the button and the bull stopped in its tracks. This made the New York Times, perfectly understandable. It should have. It's pretty dramatic. But there are people I've spoken to who say, look, if you put a lot of electricity into anything's brain, it's going to stop. So whether he really got to a set of a neural pathway that was really interesting, it's hard to know. And of course, Elon Musk told us last year that he was going to, through his Neuralink project, put chips in the human brain by now. We're about halfway through 2020. I'm still waiting. I watched the rollout of Neuralink with a lot of other people, and hundreds of thousands of people last year live. It was fascinating. But Mr. Musk went a lot further than his engineers did in his presentation, though. I will leave it at that. Now, DARPA is also funding efforts to develop better brain implants, recording from 1 million neurons. Somebody who was in DARPA a few years ago said to me when this was announced, I said, what can it do? And this fellow said, frankly, we don't know what it can do. Maybe it can get brains to talk to each other directly. Nobody really knows what you could do with this, something like this. But the idea, as has been said, to make this non-surgical, and Dr. Anakiva's work is really speaking to this, this has to be, you can't have chronically implanted, cable implanted or wire implanted soldiers running around. It has to be done in some non-surgical fashion. But I often think that in the modern era, we are so device-oriented, or I might say gadget-oriented, that we're losing touch with other options for brain-computer interface. So I was just part of this committee that reported out last year through the National Academies to ODNI. It was a decadal survey. So a decadal survey in National Academies language is a 10-year projection, which is sort of what we're being asked to do today. What can the social behavioral sciences give the intelligence community, the analysts, within 10 years or so? And actually, this one isn't hard. You can figure out how to integrate intelligence analysts with systems. You don't have to put anything in their heads. You don't have to put anything on top of their heads. You have to train the systems to work with them and them to work with the system. So look, I will leave it to you to read this report or the executive summary of this report. I do think that we are so preoccupied with gadgets sometimes that we lose these other angles and these other options. And I will just put a footnote in here because we started a little early. I'm going to use another minute. Much of what we learned or tried to understand during the Second World War, after the war in the 1950s, about soldiers working together, particularly in exercises that involved survival, they were social psychology studies. I don't know how valuable they turned out to be, but we were more sensitive to other ways of understanding the way that brains work with each other in bodies than we are now. So much of this is really about, I think, I want to suggest that social psychology is also relevant to neuroscience. Call it social neuroscience. So back to the technology. Of course, we're in this era of non-invasive brain imaging. Everybody gets excited about the images, understandably. Many of my colleagues at Penn would not be able to sustain their labs without lots of money to do fMRI in various brilliant ways. PET, functional NIRS, also pretty popular technologies for doing this kind of work. Years ago, this is really 12, 13 years ago, I was very involved with the Academy's project that had to do with deception detection. As you may recall, those of you who are old enough, after 9/11, people were really interested in the idea whether you could somehow scan the brains of people walking into sensitive places like the lobbies of an airport to see if they might have be expressing hostile ideation, hostile intent. There was a lot of money, I think, spent on projects to see if you could do that. So, this was one example of what people were talking about. Farwell's so-called brain fingerprinter, which is a really weird oxymoron, using the guilty knowledge test, but there are lots of problems. The P300 wave is, as I'm sure you know, a wave that we emit within 300 to 500 milliseconds of seeing an image that we think we recognize. We could be wrong, by the way. But all of these problems come up when you start trying to work on deception detection and the guilty knowledge test and these kinds of crude measures. This is the project in which I was exposed to this deception detection issue, this is 2008. Very unusual for a National Academies report, in my experience, to be explicit about disagreements within the committee. National Academies committees and the National Academy infrastructure really doesn't like that. The culture of National Academies is not about telling you where people disagree. But there was actually a full page box devoted to a serious disagreement about whether deception detection is a plausible goal for the intelligence community. So I just want to call your attention to this. I think it is somewhat unusual. And this is the plain Jane, plain Jack title that was given to this report, because a lot of it is, pretty creepy if you could actually do deception detection. Ideas that you can do something like functional MRI in a movie theater lobby or an airport lobby, you'd have to have a really big magnet that would pull all the metal on your body or in your body toward the magnet. So I think people abandon that notion, not to mention the base rate fallacy, which I went past pretty fast before. But if, as this is one of the problems, by the way, right now with serology testing for the coronavirus, the less of it there is in the community, the less hostile intent there is in the community, the less terrorist intent there is in the community, you've got an insane amount of false positives. And what do you do when people go through the airport and you pick up all those false positives? If you've got 100 people going through the detector every minute or 2 minutes, you've got a lot of people to detain who are going to miss their flights. So back to a little bit of the old-fashioned propaganda. I love this history. So Cardinal Mengenti was in a show trial in Budapest by the communist regime not long after the communist government assumed power in Hungary. He looked a little weird during the show trial, and some people suspected he was exposed to LSD. A Florida journalist coined the term brainwashing for what might have happened to the cardinal when he gave a very kind of really weird confession on the stand. And we know how much this is part of popular culture. I love to show my students this stuff because they don't know it, but probably a lot of people know about MK Ultra and the fact that there was very serious interest both here and in the UK. And by the way, also in Czechoslovakia and in Bulgaria. I can tell you more about that on another occasion. In the possibilities of psychotropics like LSD for brainwashing or for as a kind of truth serum. This is now part of our popular culture. And as you probably know, this was revealed in the mid-1970s during a couple of the Vice President Rockefeller and Senator Church had their commissions. I think the CIA is still suffering from these revelations culturally, still a problem. But this is sort of very much part of our cultural history. And I think it colors the conversations we have about neuroscience and national security still. So back to pharmacology, and now again talking about manipulation. There is some indication that from about at least half a dozen studies that were done in Switzerland with oxytocin through the nasal route, that you actually can encourage cooperation in a competitive gaming situation. And this led to theorizing that if you could use something like oxytocin, sometimes called the trust drug, sometimes called the cuddle drug, because supposedly after we engage in a certain intimate human activity, we are producing a lot of oxytocin. Actually, I said to my undergrads that that's true but if you're a man, you just fall asleep. So some people thought, well, maybe you could use this in interrogations to make people more trusting. Would this be less invasive than waterboarding? That's a rhetorical question. Some people would say, well, actually, it's more invasive. It's more intrusive than a physical intervention like that kind of enhanced interrogation. Don't know. Then there is a notion that some people have that you could actually use a beta blocker to treat or even prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. This I think is about 17 years since there were some indications from some clinical studies that this might help for people who've undergone a traumatic crime, that along with psychotherapy, beta blockers might be somewhat useful. But I don't know that this is reliable, but it is an interesting concept. So I know we've gone way beyond the kind of optogenetics that can be shown in this little video, but I'd love to show the video anyway, because this is, I call this the very hungry mouse. You can see where this was published. Chronically implanted mouse, again, with a laser light. Again, this is pushing opsin around in the mouse brain through pathways. You can push it around and you can follow it where it goes. Kind of remarkable work, at least, to somebody like me. So when the light is off, the mouse is not hungry. When the light is on, the laser light is on, the mouse takes a great interest in this popcorn. To me, I'll eat salted buttered popcorn under any circumstances. You don't have to put anything in my head to make me do that. Now, there are those who are skeptical about this kind of thing. So, well, it's a cool movie, but what does it really come to? I would say that if you're into an area, psychotherapy area, like for eating disorders, you might learn something from this kind of effort about how to manage people, perhaps someday with psychopharmacology with eating disorders. Don't know. I just want to point out that it was not only the US that was doing the LSD research. By the way, there's a project in the UK called Operation Moneybags. My undergraduates love to watch this a video. You can Google it, of British soldiers and LSD. It's about 2 minutes long. It's from 1964. And this is the letter that the Secretary of State for Defense wrote to Parliament when this came out 31 years later. And you can see that the argument is, well, we couldn't tell them what was going on because that would have queered the study. And so I will leave you to decide whether that was ethical or not. But this story leads me to incapacitants. So we know about the Dubrovka Theater tragedy. I have tried to figure out how many people actually died when Russian special forces pumped into the HVAC what looks like carfentanil. By the way, the U.S. was also interested in carfentanil for crowd control. There was a Marine Corps Research University project at Penn State around this time, which I think ended after this happened. So up to 170 people died. And virtually all of the children who were left in as hostages died, perhaps because the way they fell asleep obstructed their airways. Now, we can argue about whether this was a good move or not. The Chechens definitely were about to blow up the building. And we don't exactly know even now what happened when Russian special forces entered that building. But I think it suggests that these kinds of incapacitants are clumsy at best. And we had, unfortunately, our own domestic example of how clumsy an intervention this is. This is an incapacitant, whether it was pepper spray or something else, maybe not tear gas, maybe a pepper spray. This is an incapacitant. This is a very clumsy way of managing a crowd, and I will leave it at that. My friend and colleague Malcolm Dando, emeritus from University of Bradford in the UK, has pointed out in his work, I think, something quite important, that the Brain Initiative, the US Brain Initiative, has not really paid attention to what you might consider dual use. And so I want to call your attention to it with taking some ideas from Malcolm on this slide. If you can figure out what the mechanics are of the brain with respect to chemicals, you also need to figure out what the risks are when you're getting that knowledge. And I will simply leave it at that. That there are some important questions that need to be asked here about chemicals and incapacitation. Moving quickly, this is Secretary Work's remark, which I think is really on point. That the third offset, which I mentioned earlier, is really about human-machine collaborative combat networks. That's what we're really talking about here. And there are some examples, just for the sake of posterity. I made this slide. What is an autonomous or semi-autonomous weapon? This is a matter of intuition, it seems to me. We know about unmanned aerial vehicles on the loop, that is to say, a human being does an intervention. But as I think Bob Latif mentioned earlier, it's the tempo, it's the speed of warfare in the modern battlefield that, despite, I think, our military leadership's best wishes, is pushing us in the direction of more and more AI. And I think people are I'm saying this as a civilian observer of this conversation. I think people in the DoD, the leadership, are being dragged kicking and screaming in this direction. I would welcome people like Bob and Joe and Dan and others to comment on this. I think this is the direction we are moving in. And yet we are told, look, this is still supervised. And I'm not going to go through this slide for the sake of time. This is still supervised. We are still talking about some form of human system collaboration. I understand that. And yet in this same document from a couple of years ago, it's also said, as I just said, speed matters. The battle space now is so fast that people are dependent on the information they're getting through algorithms that they have not written, or algorithms that assume a whole heck of a lot. You don't necessarily need to figure out whether you can make a computer that simulates the human brain to make these kinds of autonomous capabilities. You don't need to go that deep. You don't need to have general AI. And I think this is very important. Some people whose AI work is being funded by DARPA may not want me to say this, but I don't think you need to go this deep. I love that work, but if you're looking for functional capacities, you don't necessarily need to solve the big philosophical problems. But we do have lots of ethical problems. I may surprise you. I teach bioethics, but I haven't said much about the ethics yet. But here's Peter Asaro, who I think nicely summarizes some of the problems when you get to different forms of what he calls robotic agency. In other words, you want a robot that knows what the heck is going on here. So far, no system, so far as I know, has the ability to make a judgment and understand what these creatures are pointing at each other or the context in which they're doing it. And until we can do that, I think, for example, Samsung's robot, which I think has been at the DMZ for 13, 14 years. I think it's the weapon of the future and always will be, until we can figure out this problem, which is a grave problem. And I don't see how you work this into the laws of armed conflict successfully, and he has to figure this out. I love this line from Michael Schrage from MIT. I don't know Professor Schrage, maybe some of you do, but it's a great line, which just gives me the excuse to show you this slide. I'm not going to play the film. You know the film. The Doomsday Machine is not where I think we want to go. Although I've watched this movie about 80 times since I was 14 or 13 years old, and it's always good. But the Doomsday device is not, I think, where we want to go. So I know Joe and Dan and the other organizers said, please predict, tell us where we could be going. I'm cheating. This is where this National Academies Committee said we could be going in the near term. In the near term. Now, by my calculations, we should already be there, but we aren't. GSR, immersive virtual reality. Well, we're sort of in virtual reality. I've got a $199 Oculus my kids got me for my birthday a couple of years ago. It's okay. It's not terrific. It's good with cartoons. It's not so good with actual films. By now, we could have had in-helmet EEG, biomarkers for predicting soldier response, and they could have been iterative. Far term, that's now, right? In-vehicle deployment of TMS. I'm still saying, if I'm a commander, I want to know how this helps me. And I've got a lot of other things I want to spend money on. So this is great. Maybe a lot of this is now on the shelf. And maybe someday it will work. But more importantly, maybe someday people will find a reason to invest in it. So I want to say to Bob Ladoff and Joe Zika and Dan and others who invited me, this is my prediction. My prediction comes from 11 years ago. Not there yet. Thank you so much.